Luxembourg, December 1995. A courtroom judgment was about to permanently alter the economics of European professional football forever. The European Court of Justice, seated in Luxembourg, delivered a ruling that no football authority had anticipated with full seriousness. Across Europe, club chairmen, agents, and players would wake to news that fundamentally changed their professional relationships and contractual rights. The case bore the name of one Belgian midfielder, Jean-Marc Bosman, whose contract dispute had travelled through years of legal proceedings. On the 15th of December, 1995, Case CF 15/93 was formally decided, reshaping the transfer system that had governed football for decades. Before the ruling, European football operated under a transfer system that required fees even for out-of-contract players moving between clubs. Clubs held significant power over players whose contracts had expired, demanding compensation before permitting any transfer to another club. This system meant players could not freely move to new employers even after their contractual obligations to a club had formally ended. The ruling in Case CF 15/93 held that such transfer fee requirements for out-of-contract players violated European Community Free Movement law. After December 1995, players whose contracts had expired could move freely to clubs in other EU member states without transfer fees. The judgment also addressed nationality clauses, ruling that restrictions on fielding players from other EU member states were unlawful. Clubs across Europe rapidly began reassessing their squad-building strategies in light of the court's two principal holdings. Transfer fees for players still under contract remained lawful. The ruling specifically concerned players whose contracts had already expired. The volume of free transfers in European football increased noticeably in the seasons immediately following the December 1995 judgment. Clubs began offering longer contracts and higher wages to retain players, since losing them on a free transfer carried no compensation. Player agents gained considerably more leverage in negotiations, as clubs competed to secure signatures before contracts reached expiry. Wage structures at major European clubs shifted upward as the balance of contractual power moved toward players and their representatives. Smaller clubs, who had relied on transfer fees from selling out-of-contract players, faced new financial pressures after the ruling. The ruling accelerated a concentration of playing talent at wealthier clubs, which could offer the most competitive wage packages. UEFA and national football associations were required to amend their regulations to comply with the European Court of Justice's findings. The ruling's effects extended beyond the European Union, influencing transfer practices in countries with association agreements with the EU. FIFA eventually revised its global transfer regulations to reflect the principles established by the European Court of Justice judgment. The Bosman ruling is formally cited in subsequent European Court of Justice cases concerning the free movement of workers in sport. Academies and youth development programs became more strategically important as clubs sought to develop talent they could retain contractual. The transfer market as a commercial institution was fundamentally restructured by a single legal judgment delivered in Luxembourg in 1995. Jean-Marc Bosman was a Belgian professional footballer who played for RFC Liège in the Belgian First Division during the late 1980s. In 1990, Bosman's contract with RFC Liège expired and he sought to move to the French club US Dunkirk on a free transfer. RFC Liège demanded a transfer fee from US Dunkirk, which the French club was unable or unwilling to meet, blocking the move. Bosman was subsequently placed on a reduced wage by RFC Liège and found himself effectively unable to pursue his professional career. He initiated legal proceedings in Belgium, arguing that the transfer system violated his rights under European Community law on free movement. The Belgian courts referred questions to the European Court of Justice under Article 177 of the EC Treaty for a preliminary ruling. The case formally became Case CF 15/93 before the European Court of Justice, with proceedings spanning several years of legal argument. UEFA and National Football Association submitted observations to the court, arguing that the transfer system served legitimate sporting objectives. The football authorities contended that transfer fees maintained competitive balance and supported investment in youth development across clubs. Advocate General Karl Otto Lenz delivered his opinion in the case on the 20th of September, 1995, before the court's final judgment. Advocate General Lenz's opinion concluded that the transfer rules and nationality clauses were incompatible with European Community law. The opinion of the Advocate General is a formal advisory document. The court was not bound by it but considered it carefully. The football world watched the Luxembourg proceedings with growing concern, aware that an adverse ruling would require fundamental regulatory change. The European Court of Justice heard the case as a grand chamber, reflecting the constitutional significance of the questions referred. The court examined whether the transfer rules constituted an obstacle to the free movement of workers under Article 48 of the EC Treaty. Article 48 of the EC Treaty guaranteed workers the right to move freely between member states to accept offers of employment. The court found that professional footballers were workers within the meaning of Article 48 and were entitled to its protections. The judgment confirmed that the transfer fee requirement for out-of-contract players directly impeded the exercise of free movement rights. The court rejected the argument that the transfer system was justified solely by the need to maintain competitive balance between clubs. The court also rejected the argument that transfer fees were justified as compensation for investment in training and development of players. The judgment noted that transfer fees bore no necessary relationship to the actual costs incurred in training a particular player. On the nationality clause question, the court found that restrictions on fielding EU nationals from other member states violated Article 48. UEFA had operated a rule limiting the number of foreign players clubs could field in European competition, known as the 3+2 rule. The court held that this nationality restriction, as applied to EU nationals, was incompatible with the free movement of workers principle. The ruling did not address restrictions on players from outside the European Union, which remained a separate regulatory matter for authorities. The court's judgment was delivered on the 15th of December, 1995 and immediately became one of the most significant rulings in sports law history. UEFA's initial public response expressed concern about the ruling's potential consequences for the structure of European club football. National football associations across Europe were required to review and amend their own transfer regulations to comply with the judgment. The Football Association in England and other national bodies began the process of aligning domestic rules with the court's findings. The ruling applied directly to transfers between clubs in different EU member states. Domestic transfer rules required separate national consideration. In practice, most European leagues moved to apply the free transfer principle broadly, including to domestic transfers between clubs. The Bosman ruling did not abolish transfer fees entirely. Fees for players still under contract remained a lawful commercial arrangement. Record transfer fees continued to be paid for players under contract in the years following the 1995 ruling, demonstrating this distinction. The ruling created a clear commercial incentive for clubs to sell players before their contracts expired rather than lose them for free. Contract extension negotiations became a more prominent feature of club management in the post-Bosman era of European professional football. The ruling's impact on competitive balance between clubs was debated extensively by economists, administrators, and football commentators after 1995. Some analysts argued the ruling accelerated the concentration of top players at the wealthiest clubs in the major European leagues. Others noted that free transfers allowed smaller clubs to recruit experienced players they could not previously have afforded through transfer fees. The ruling's effect on youth development funding was a persistent concern, as clubs lost a revenue stream from selling developed players. UEFA subsequently introduced training compensation and solidarity mechanisms within its regulations to address youth development funding concerns. FIFA's regulations on the status and transfer of players were revised in subsequent years to incorporate Bosman-compatible principles globally. The ruling's legal basis in European Community free movement law meant it applied to all EU member states without requiring separate implementation. Subsequent European Court of Justice cases in sports law, including Kolpak and Simutenkov, built upon the principles established in Bosman. The Kolpak ruling in 2003 extended similar free movement principles to nationals of countries with association agreements with the European Union. Jean-Marc Bosman himself received a settlement in his personal legal dispute, the details of which are a matter of public record. The case demonstrated that professional sport conducted as an economic activity was subject to European Community law and its fundamental principles. Football's governing bodies had previously operated on the assumption that sporting rules were largely exempt from general competition law scrutiny. The Bosman judgment challenged that assumption directly, establishing that economic activities in sport were not automatically exempt from treaty obligations. The ruling also had implications for European competition law, though the court's primary holding rested on free movement of workers' provisions. The case attracted significant academic commentary in European law journals and sports law publications throughout the late 1990s and beyond. The ruling's significance was recognized not only in football but across professional sport in Europe, prompting regulatory reviews in other disciplines. Rugby union, basketball, and other professional sports in Europe examined their own transfer and employment rules in light of the judgment. The ruling reinforced the principle that European community law applied to employment relationships in professional sport without general exemption. UEFA worked with the European Commission in subsequent years to develop a framework for transfer regulations compatible with European law. The European Commission's involvement in football governance increased after the Bosman ruling, reflecting sport status as an economic activity. The ruling prompted ongoing dialogue between football's governing bodies and European institutions about the appropriate regulation of professional sport. The transfer window system, introduced by FIFA in 2002, was a regulatory development that occurred in the post-Bosman landscape of football. The introduction of transfer windows was a separate regulatory decision by FIFA and was not directly mandated by the Bosman judgment itself. The Bosman ruling's interaction with UEFA's financial fair play regulations, introduced in 2010, generated further academic and legal commentary. 30 years after the judgment, Case CF 1593 remains a foundational reference point in European sports law and employment law scholarship. The lasting legacy of the Bosman ruling is visible in every transfer window, every expiring contract negotiation across European professional football. Players in the modern era exercise contractual freedoms that were unavailable to their predecessors under the pre-1995 transfer system. The ruling demonstrated that a single individual's legal challenge could produce structural change across an entire international industry. Jean-Marc Bosman's name became permanently associated with a legal principle that outlasted his own playing career by many decades. The European Court of Justice's judgment confirmed that European community law applied to the economic dimensions of professional sport. Football's governing bodies adapted their regulations over time, working within the legal framework established by the 1995 judgment. The ruling's impact on player wages, transfer fees, and club finances has been studied extensively by sports economists since 1995. The concentration of financial resources at elite clubs, a documented trend in European football, has multiple causes beyond the Bosman ruling alone. The ruling's nationality clause holding changed the composition of squads in European club competitions in the seasons following December 1995. Domestic leagues across Europe saw an increase in the number of players from other EU member states in the post-Bosman period. The ruling's effects on national team football, including concerns about opportunities for domestic players, were debated by administrators for years. UEFA introduced homegrown player rules in 2006 as a regulatory response to concerns about opportunities for domestically trained players. The Bosman ruling stands as evidence that European legal institutions could and would intervene in the governance of professional sport. Case C for 1593 remains a defining moment in the legal history of European football and in the broader development of sports law. The transfer market as we know it was shaped in a Luxembourg courtroom by a judgment delivered on the 15th of December, 1995.